Welcome to the 365 Days of Compassion Book Club podcast. It's Chris, the host of the book club and the creator of the hashtag 365 Days of Compassion. In the book club, we chat with an author whose work brings a compassionate approach to well-being. This month, we meet with Ann Parkinson, who considers how to bring a compassionate approach to chronic health conditions and the management of pain. Hope you enjoy the episode. Here it comes. Hello and welcome to the 365 Days of Compassion Book Club and the July event. Really pleased to have Ann Parkinson here with us as our guest author. In Anne's book, which we're going to be chatting about today, she wrote that people in pain have often said to me, I don't like the me I am not me anymore. And she also put that struggling with pain and other health issues can be difficult. We need compassion and courage to help explore what's challenging and find what's meaningful. And I think the reason I've just highlighted those words was I think that's going to be very much part of what we're going to chat about today. Because I think that, for me, those couple of sentences kind of, I didn't sum the book up because that would be wrong to say that you could sum the book up in that way. But I think they go to perhaps some of the core parts of the book that Anne's written. So I'll just do a quick introduction of Anne. So the book that we're going to be chatting about is Dancing Through Life, A Guide to Living Well, which Anne published in 2020. Anne founded Unity Physiotherapy in 2009, providing services in the Lincoln area and also online, which perhaps we'll chat a little bit about some of those workshops, etc. as well. And has a focus on supporting people with chronic pain and health conditions such as ME, CFS. Her approach takes a blend of techniques, and again we may touch upon that I think during the conversation, blending things like yoga and adapting elements of therapeutic approaches such as acceptance and commitment therapy and compassion focused therapy, although obviously not in a clinical setting. So I was using things like compassionate mind training exercise as part of the support that she provides to people. And I think something that I know I kind of share with Anne is that I think, Anne, you're always very keen to learn and develop the skills and knowledge to both help yourself and to primarily help others as well. So thank you very much for being our guest.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me. And they're important bits that you highlight from the book, actually. And that features throughout my work as well. Allowing people to be exactly as they are and know nothing's wrong with them, and to find that meaning and purpose again. So really important points that you highlighted.
Yeah, it struck me when I remember going through the book. I mean, there are lots of bits I could probably have highlighted actually. I'm always interested how authors decide upon the title of the book, because I always think that must be, seems a very straightforward thing, but I guess it's quite a challenge. So the book is Dancing Through Life, A Guide to Living Well. What inspired that title?
You know, I actually can't remember what inspired it exactly, what the thought processes were, because I think the title came in 2019, because this was a book that evolved over many years. Oh. But I remember trying to think of something that summed up the whole book and the humanness of being in life, the joys and the sorrows, you know, the ups and the downs, the whole of everything, and how everything's always changing and adapting. And I can't remember exactly where the thought process went. One day that just landed, and I thought, actually, that really reflects that fluidity, that flow, the rhythm changes, the speed changes, the tones, the expressions, the understanding, the awareness we need of the rhythms and what's present in that kind of ever-changing flux and flow. And if we don't understand them, we can't go with them. And if we don't listen, we're probably avoiding them. So it's that kind of beautiful kind of balance, isn't it, between the rhythm and listening and going with it and knowing when to have that pause, that still point. And I think that's probably some of what came into it. Was a lot of what came into it. How it got there, I don't know.
That's really interesting. Given I quite like a bit of kitchen dancing, I did like the title, but my kitchen dancing doesn't involve any form of rhythm.
But there'd be some sort of there's connection and awareness and flow and presence and things in there, isn't it? And enjoyment and all sorts of, different emotions and different tonalities to it and fun. And yeah, dancing says so much, doesn't it? And some people have taken the title literally. A few people have taken it literally.
Oh, really?
No, it's not a book about dancing, but
I like that. I do. Well, I guess in the book you're very open. You've shared your own personal experience of chronic pain, health conditions, which actually I think I guess obviously has inspired the book and inspired your work, I guess, as well. How does your daily practice, perhaps a focus on around the compassion, help with managing symptoms?
So I think probably need to say that symptoms have massively changed. I mean, I lived with persistent pain for many, many years, which is how I ended up specialising in persistent pain and doing the work I did. But then health issues that for the last couple of years through various things, I think infections and surgeries and antibiotics and moving house on top of that when I was already unwell, and COVID and various things absolutely took me off my feet. So symptoms have changed, and I reflected on sort of daily practices and things, and really hard to split between practices and a way of being. So some practices, absolutely, going on the yoga mat, that's a clear practice, but it's also a way of being. But meditation is a clear practice. But then the other stuff during the day is like, well, what point are they practices and what points are they my ways of being? And as reflected actually through those health issues, which is one reason I mention it, is that the practices had to come much more back in that I used to use more, if that makes sense. Because my self-critic got so loud again, very old patterns came back up because my functional level was really very low. If I said that I couldn't stand for a few minutes without being short of breath, that might give a bit of an indication of my functional level. So there were many losses, many things I couldn't do. And very threat system, very self-critic, getting very loud, an element of self-blame. You're a therapist, you can't get yourself better. I'm like, oh, okay, that's nice. So I would say that the practices then became practices again. So compassionate mind training based exercises that I don't use in daily life exactly now, probably elements come into ways of being. They became practices again. Really compassionately reframing became practices again, whereas before that had kind of calmed down a lot, and I'd really worked to get my language to be compassionate and non-violent to me and to others. And so then they became practices again, back into a way of being. So I think my practices are a way of being, and then there are practices, if that makes sense. It's hard to explain.
I get what you mean in terms of, I think sometimes when we've done things like compassionate mind training or those kind of acceptance, commitment therapy type exercise, or you do get into a frame of mind. I think sometimes you then build it in, as you say, to daily life. It's almost like a subconscious piece of it. I think at times when things can get more challenging, sometimes it's at more conscious exercise level that may be needed just to kind of bolster what you're doing throughout the day-to-day life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so like the yoga on the mat practices, I take compassion into that. So the way that I would approach my mat practice is in a compassionate, curious way with playfulness rather than the striving and the threat drive system of like, got to achieve this asana, this shape, this pose, which is not really how it's recommended to practice yoga, but that's what some people do. The way we approach our yoga mats, so the way I approach my yoga mat, and if I notice that, if I'm feeling low in energy, then I will do a certain type of practice. So my practices are always adapting as well. So it comes into everything. And meditation, is a really helpful way for me to start the day. It brings me really present. It helps to kind of really access that soothing system physiology, that parasympathetic nervous system, really connects me to how I want to be that day. So there are certain practices that really help. And then if I was struggling with pain, it'd be, again, meditation, gentle yoga, noticing if my self-critic's coming in a bit, giving myself permission just to rest. So yeah.
And I guess just listening to that, what perhaps leads the question onto, so that obviously you said the book was originally started around 2019, published in 2020. Given that, is there any aspects from the last couple of years that you might perhaps have changed, would cause any changes to the book, or perhaps put a different emphasis on the book at all?
Yeah, there is actually. And the book published 2020, I can't actually think how many years before that it started. I would say 2017 onwards would be when I was most working on it.
Right.
But
okay.
probably 10 years prior to that, I started a book and shelved it. And it was obviously, there's a book in here, and no, it's not ready to even come into form yet. I guess when I reflected, I thought, there are bits like the paces and sims, which I know we'll come on to. Somehow nature didn't go in that, which is a massively important thing to me and in my work. And I thought, how is that not one of in the acronym? But it's in the book. And I think what I would change is bringing in much more of the spirit side of mind, body, spirit, which you can't really split that much more depth of meaning and purpose, that connection to the wider whole and the interconnectedness. I think when I wrote the book, I probably didn't know how to do that, didn't know how to weave it in, and it's become much clearer, but also much more evident of the importance of it through my last couple of years, I guess, and I want to bring that into my work much more. So I think I would bring that in, and also yoga's not in it that much. And I think that might be because although I've got many years of practice and I've done training with physios that are yoga teachers, I hadn't actually done my yoga teacher training because I did that in 2020. So I probably didn't feel that I was qualified enough to bring that in. So I think it would become much more integrated in that way, because it is an integrative piece of work, but I think the spiritual side would need to come in, and nature much more as well.
And we both have a real interest in that kind of nature connectedness, and we've chatted a few times around that. You've mentioned the acronyms, PACE and SIM, and one of the parts of the PACE acronym is compassion, and one of the C's. So could you just explore those acronyms just a little bit more? And I would be quite interested, just particularly obviously around how they link in with things like compassionate mind training.
Yeah, absolutely. So the PACEs and SIMs, there's PACEs and SIMs and an N. So the N is nutrition, but there needs to be two N's, which is nature. I didn't actually write about nutrition much in the book because, again, I wasn't at the time qualified. I've done some qualification that would, again, I would add that in a little bit. The PACEs and SIM, basically each letter of the PACEs and each letter of the SIMs is the letter each word starts with that comes into it. So, for example, the 6 P's, of which patience, practice, persistence, C's are things like compassion, courage, curiosity. So that's how I kind of made the acronyms. I think so obviously compassion is very central, and compassionate awareness actually is central. So one of the A's in PACES is awareness. And it's central to that. And I probably didn't make that clear in the book, that it's foundational to build on. I've reflected on that since then. So that's something else I would change, to make it clear that that's absolutely foundational. I talked about compassion and awareness together. So compassionate awareness, but I didn't talk about it as a foundation of that kind of model. So I would change that, because the way in which we pay attention matters. Because if it's judgmental, that's not particularly helpful. One of the C's is curiosity, which compassionate mind training, that intention to be curious with our attention. And that goes with the compassion and the non-judgment way of paying attention. So that attitude to be observing with curiosity. Another C is courage. So it takes courage to be present with our suffering in that non-judgmental way. So that's really important. I think the I is really important. That's in the SIMS bit of that acronym. So it's one I. And that can be how we want to show up in the day, but also, to be that compassionate person for ourselves and others, but also that intention to be helpful, not harmful, as in the sort of compassion and compassion-focused therapy. The intention to pay attention in a curious and compassionate way. So they kind of all can be linked into compassion, a lot of them. I made some notes down, like acceptance is 1A, accepting what's present in a compassionate way, allowing it to be before we then see what action we want to take. So the wise action is an action's another A in the PACES. So they're all interlinked. And by being present, which is one of the P's, in a compassionate way with awareness, so you've got C's and A's, then it helps us see more choices, and that's one of the C's, to take action. So, and that action is then wise action from that compassionate place. So, and the flexible persistence is a P, but it's got a silent F because it's flexible persistence. And that can be persisting, living in line with our values, persistent in being compassionate to ourselves when the self-critic is showing up. So there's lots of ways I reflected on how they can come into how they can come into compassion. And I found that actually really interesting when I did that, because obviously when I wrote the book, it was before I'd gone so deeply into this work, and so it's interesting. And
I'm interested because one of the elements around compassion that often comes back in, or gets talked about within CMT or CFT, is that people who either clients in the clinical setting or in a non-clinical setting, individuals can often find some kind of fears and barriers, resistance to compassion. And I did wonder whether, when people are experiencing chronic health conditions or chronic pain, that probably does bring out some of those kind of fears or the barriers. And I just wondered if you could reflect on the work that you've done with people. How does that manifest itself? How do people react to the idea of bringing compassion to themselves when, as a quote I put in the introduction, people often say they don't feel like themselves. Is that quite a challenge to them?
Quite often, yes. I think that it varies based on people's beliefs and previous experiences and things, but I would say there are common themes for people. So persistent pain and things like ME/CFS and long COVID and things, they have a certain impact on the whole person, on that kind of understanding of who they are, how they fit in the world. There's often not the sense of belonging and fitting in is often impacted. Often people are not feeling good enough for many reasons, which can come into previous experience, but it's also society that encourages that striving, always doing, kind of competing, almost glorifies being busy. And when people can't do that, they feel they kind of don't belong, they're not good enough, they can't do it, they're being negatively judged. So that then comes into some of the fears and blocks and myths of compassion. So one of the things that comes into is that myth of compassion being weak and soft and fluffy, and that when they're already not feeling good enough, and they perhaps have a view that compassion's weak and they feel that their body's weak because it's let them down, there's a whole kind of mix of things going on, and often needs that kind of psychoeducation and things to help with that. So that's quite a common one. Fear of negative judgment, because they're already feeling they don't fit in, they're not feeling understood and heard and seen, they're often negatively judging themselves. So that feeling of not belonging and feeling disconnected means that there's that kind of fear of negative judgment, that if being compassionate to themselves meant acknowledging limitations and doing what's meaningful, but pacing it in a different way, how's that going to be judged by others? And then that fear of being negatively judged about the amount they're doing, that can block it. If they've also always been someone that's always overdone things, that kind of fear of being negatively judged because they're not doing enough. So that's another one. And one other I thought of was a distraction of pain. If pain is very over-focused on, which it naturally takes our attention, but over time it kind of really narrows that view, like your hands in front of your face, can't see anything else around it, then it's really difficult for people to be compassionate, and they can't see how it's going to help because they've got pain in their face. It's there all the time, all they can see. So a block can be that they can't think it's going to help them because this pain's kind of dominating everything. And again, sometimes that's psychoeducation to help with around pain and also compassion, and sometimes it's other attention training first before doing that to help with those. There's numbers of ways you can help with the blocks and things, but there's lots of things that come up.
Yeah, I mean, just listen to that. I'm just reflecting on kind of the complex emotions that people experience on that, which are often linked with kind of fears and resistance or barriers to compassion. So from what you've just described, you can sense that people will have shame or guilt because they can't do things, as well as all the negative. And it really comes across this piece about that they're almost being defined by the pain, and that must be quite hard to kind of to work through.
Yeah, absolutely. All those emotions, anxiety as well is a really common one, and yeah, they start to be defined by the pain, because if there's been many losses and there's also then grief, they don't know who they are anymore sometimes, and that kind of pain can become a bit of a identity. So the whole mix of things, and lots of the research around pain, obviously the anxiety is often a common secondary consequence, as is self-criticism and things, and they also kind of pre-existed. But that's one of the ways that compassion and compassionate mind training have been shown to help, is with the secondary consequences. Although there are some pilot studies showing that it can actually help with pain intensity, which would be my experience personally and clinically as well. I've kind of gone off topic a bit there, but I thought I'd drop that in.
No, it's interesting because you also mentioned loss and grief, and obviously last book club we chatted about that, but I think sometimes we think about loss and grief in terms of obviously bereavement but actually there is a loss and grief associated with not being able to do what you were doing before, the health condition or the chronic pain interfered with what you were doing.
Absolutely. That's so important and often really under-acknowledged. I wrote a blog on that, which ended up in 2 parts. I had more to say than I thought it did as a non-psychologist, non-psychological clinician, but often not well acknowledged by society, by healthcare professionals. It's important.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in there, because one of the things, because I worked in health psychology for a long time, and also grief about the life that people thought they would have.
Yeah.
I think it's quite key as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes people do need some psychological help with that. Sometimes they get stuck in it. So it's also knowing when people need to be kind of referred on. I've done some of Darcy's training actually with the non-death losses, which was really helpful. And how one of the really important things is that with death losses, and we have a ritual and we have a community, but with the non-death losses, like with living with persistent pain, you're feeling isolated and disconnected and a lack of sense of belonging, and there's no recognition of it and no kind of ritual to represent it, and they're important things as well. So,
and that's an interesting point as well, because you know, my wife has a chronic health condition and struggles with pain as well, and I think sometimes the wider family doesn't also get thought about within that as well, the caring role as well. So
yeah, absolutely, and there's grief and losses in that as well, and so all of these things can also, you know, block bringing compassionate to the self and accepting compassion in terms of the three flows of compassion. You know, people not feeling good enough is going to block that coming in. So
I want to just go back to something you did mention a minute or two ago. You talked about psychoeducation, and I thought it was interesting and helpful actually that the first chapter in the book is around the physiology and neurology aspects of the body. So you before you've got into anything else, that's you've spent a whole chapter kind of setting the scene around that. Obviously, that, and from what you've said, that is a really key important factor to the people you work with and kind of the idea you were trying to get across.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't understand something, you can't allow it to fully be and then make changes. If if you don't understand some of the complexities in pain, you're going to be blocked from working with some of the aspects that can be helpful. I think psychoeducation is a massive topic, so it can come into pain specifically, as in the neurophysiology of pain, but then into being human and compassion and philosophy and lots of different things that come into that. But it's got to be right for the person. So unfortunately, psychoeducation can end up being a knowledge dump, and I've done that. And it's why it's so important to check someone's understanding, to know what their kind of tolerance level is for information. What language do they use? Can you match yours to theirs? What's going to be helpful for them in the context that they're struggling with? You know, it's really an art and a science, psychoeducation, I feel. And if it's too much science, as in you forget that flow of the art and the understanding and that kind of unity, then you're going to struggle, and then it's not going to be helpful. So I do think it's massively helpful. And an example, I've just run some workshops, and the first one again was it's been throughout it, but was on psychoeducation of the nervous system, so it's nervous system regulation. And the feedback after that was that it was so very helpful. And one person said how much it helped them understand themselves and what had happened to them. And they'd never had it explained in quite that way. So for them, it had hit home in a really helpful way. And it's really hard in a group setting because you don't know someone's preferences and previous knowledge level and all of those things. But I thought I'd just give an example of why it's so important. And I think people understanding that the knowledge that they're working with, and when you're kind of trying to find the right word, because you're not giving them knowledge, it's a two-way process. So I don't know what the word is for that. But when you're exploring the psychoeducation with them, that confusion is normal and helpful because it's part of learning. Because that can also come into someone's threat system because they can think they're doing it wrong or not good enough because they don't understand, or there's something wrong. And so there's kind of so many aspects to things, and I've gone off on another tangent.
No, I think the reason I was particularly interested because you talked about psychology, and I say it was the first chapter. I think
Yeah.
ideas like, oh, we have a fight and flight response, and we don't tend to talk about the rest response actually. So people can't. I think some of these ideas are out, in but they're not really perhaps expressed in the right way or in a helpful way, and just people have got concepts. So I think it is important to do just to spend that time. And I thought it was really helpful to actually have that as your first chapter. And I was just intrigued
Yeah.
that was the case, and
And it
I think
needed
it worked.
Sorry, Chris, cut you off there.
No, actually, I think it worked in terms of, obviously I'm quite comfortable with the psychoeducation bit, but for me, it set a foundation for the book then. As well as actually, I think bringing a kind of element of science into it to say, right, well, and actually, I know throughout the book you've referenced and done a lot of the kind of scientific research to support various parts of the book.
Yeah, I think that's the reason it was first was to help with that understanding, and some people may choose to skip it. And you asked about something that would change. I think one of the things I delved deeper into was polyvagal theory, and I think I'd probably bring that into that chapter as well if I was to change things. So yeah.
The challenge with science is and research is always moving on, isn't it? So with books, there's always something you think, oh, I could add that in. I'm interested as well in something that you wrote in the compassion chapter. You used a quote around this strong back and soft front. And I was a little bit intrigued because you actually also kind of referred to that as when you were writing or proofreading the book as well, how you used that approach. Could you just perhaps expand upon that phrase a little bit, and then how that kind of helped you with navigating through writing and publishing the book?
So that phrase is one I absolutely love. I've just used it quite a lot in my workshops, actually. It just really resonated. I think that the two aspects, when I first heard it, I was like, I love that. That's beautiful. And it really reflects those two sides of compassion, that real strength that we need, but that gentle strength, and then that kind of openness and willingness to be fully present and allow. So the kind of the two sides. There's that vulnerability in the being present with what's difficult and tricky and with the suffering. So you need that strength, and it's what Kristen Neff talks about as the tenderness and that fierce compassion. So it just reflected those two sides to me, and one without the other can not be so helpful sometimes. We can maybe get pulled into somebody's suffering or our own suffering without the kind of that balance of the strong back. We might give up without the balance of the strong back if we're kind of allowing, but we haven't got the strength in there. And so that really resonated. And I think the proofreading, because it was I was doing my own proofreading generally, apart from the people that kind of read the book because I self-published it, but there were lots of errors and adjustments, and it's hard for me to keep kind of track of things. But so it came into that, but where it really came into lots of aspects as I reflected, things like formatting the book for self-publishing. That was really difficult for me because technology is not my strong point. And I started to kind of notice the self-critic and getting really frustrated and thinking, and then got a relative to help me with that. That was helpful. So that kind of persistence to keep going. But where it really, I think, came in, where it really resonated with that strength to kind of stand my ground with the openness and the kind of gentleness was with some of the publishers. Because I hadn't realised that when you use people's quotes from books, it always needs permission in. I thought you could use a short quote without permission. So some publishers were absolutely fine, but there were ones that were wanting to charge. Now, I don't make much from writing books at all, and I was already paying a graphic designer to do the Paces and Sims infographic. And I thought, well, this is a bit difficult, isn't it? Because this was on top of all the other things, and I was also dealing with fatigue from early Lyme disease at the time. So it's kind of one thing after another where you just kind of, all that work to take these quotes out, because they basically wanted paying for the quotes to be used. And I thought, well, there's all this work, I'm going to have to take them out. You need threat system. And then that compassion strong backs off front of, I can see where they're coming from, why they're doing it, even though I don't agree with it. And then that persistence to kind of go with what's right, and basically ended up saying, I can't pay you, because I genuinely can't, and I will take the quotes out. And they gave permission to use it. So I guess it gave me that strength to really kind of be with that. And yeah,
that's really interesting. I've got one last question, but before I go to that, I'm just going to check with the our audience. Have we got any questions or comments or thoughts that you'd like to ask Anne or add?
I don't know that I've got any questions, Chris, because I think all your questions have been wonderful. So I can't think of any more questions. I suppose just having worked in health psychology for so long, and I don't now, I'm retired from the NHS, but I would have loved to have had your book alongside me. It would have been wonderful. We did do some compassionate mind training. Chris, I think you shared we published the outcome of that, and it was really well received, I think, and made a difference to people in terms of their self-critic mostly. And so being able to turn down the volume of that self-critic then enabled them to actually kind of widen the things that they would allow themselves to do, in a sense, including resting when necessary. So, but yeah, it just sounds like a wonderful book, which I haven't read. I hadn't come across it till today, till Chris shared that we were going to do this. But yes, I'm going to share it with all my colleagues who are still working in that service.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really important to share about that research. And that is, I know there's a pain service that has done some research as well with it, and that the secondary consequences, and one of, like you just said, the biggest impact tends to be on the self-critic and the anxious self as well with it. And that was one of my hopes as well for the book, was that it was for a whole range of audiences, including clinicians themselves for themselves, but also as to help with other strategies and things to help with people. That was one of the kind of audience ranges of the book. So yeah, thank you for sharing it with your colleagues as well.
Thank you for writing it.
It was well worth it. I thought if it helped one person, but I've had such lovely feedback. So the mammoth task that it was, I honestly never could have appreciated the amount of work in writing a book. More than you could ever imagine. So it was well worth it, though.
Good. Yeah. Good.
Thanks, Sue. That was
Yes,
brilliant. Thank you. So my last question, perhaps, is to kind of bring the discussion to, which has been a great discussion. Thank you, Anne. And actually, we could think of a few other questions actually, but and I could chat to you about Nature Connection as well for a while. But if there's one thing that, if this is easy, this might be an unfair question actually. If there's one thing or a message that you wanted to summarise for your readers to take away from the book, what would that be?
Well, yeah, that's tricky. So there's sort of two.
Well, it's a bit of an unfair question, I feel, because it's
you get away with two.
Yeah, you get two.
Okay, so the first one is that I think it's really important for people to remember when they're struggling is that it can feel really overwhelming with information, and possibilities seem limited, and so it can feel really tricky. And I think it's important people remember that there are so many different aspects which can help that are all interlinked. So if you pick one, it's going to influence something else, and there isn't a right or a wrong place to start. One of the reasons in the book that there's bullet pointed summaries is some people will struggle with the amount of information, so they can do read the summaries and do the practices. And I think probably the most important message, or what feels like the most important message, is that something that commonly comes up that we've spoken about is that people feel there's something wrong with them and they need fixing, which societal messaging and previous experiences really impact. And I think a really important message is that nobody's broken, no one needs fixing. And that it doesn't mean that changes aren't helpful, but instead it means having a compassionate acceptance of all parts of us, having a knowing that we're okay and good enough as we are. And then from this place, we can make the changes that best support ourselves and others. So that was my main message, I think.
I think that's a brilliant message. And I think that was a wonderful summary of the book, and a brilliant point to actually conclude the book club on. Unless there are any other questions or comments from the attendees. Okay. And thank you very much. I found it a really interesting discussion. Thank you for talking openly as well about, sharing your own experience, and that is reflected in the book. And thank you for those who've come along and attended. I hope you've enjoyed the event. And we will be sharing this hopefully very soon as a podcast. And thank you very much for coming along. And thank you, Anne.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for pulling it all together.
Hope you enjoyed what I think was a very insightful and helpful conversation with Anne. I'd like to thank Anne again and those who attended the event. So that's the July book event done. The August one will soon be upon us. Look out for details under the hashtag across social media for when that will be held, and hopefully you'll be able to join us in person. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.